The Vatican hides secrets older than Christianity itself. Ancient manuscripts describing visitors from the sky long before modern UFO sightings. These aren't angels or myths, but records of real unexplained phenomena witnessed by Roman soldiers, Egyptian priests, and Babylonian astronomers. Locked away in forbidden archives, these documents reveal a history deliberately erased to protect religious power. What if the Star of Bethlehem was not divine, but an aerial craft? What if the Church has been quietly controlling the narrative of human history for centuries? Behind the frescoes and sacred rituals lies an intelligence network preparing for a truth humanity isn't ready to face. When the secret finally emerges, it will shatter everything we thought we knew about faith and our place in the cosmos. Will the Church reveal this hidden history on its own terms, or keep the world in the dark forever? Stay with us, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel. There's a room in the Vatican most people will never see. It's buried beneath layers of history, bureaucracy, and reinforced concrete. And no, this isn't some Dan Brown fantasy or overhyped internet myth. The Vatican Apostolic Library, the real one, does exist. Founded formally in the mid-15th century, it's one of the oldest libraries in the world. But here's what no one talks about. Not what's in the cataloged section, but what's not. Thousands of documents, uncatalogued, untranslated, unscanned, remain locked behind gates, hidden under layers of papal privilege. And some of these documents date back, not centuries, but millennia. Now ask yourself this: if you were the most powerful religious institution on the planet, and if you possessed handwritten chronicles by Roman scribes describing phenomena they could not explain, phenomena not divine, but extraterrestrial, what would you do with them? Would you display them in a glass case next to papal robes? Or would you bury them under 100 locks and build a myth around the very idea that no such thing could ever exist? Because somewhere, between the writings of Julius Caesar's own historians and the faded parchments of monastic archivists, lies a pattern. Reports of flying shields over Gaul, of sudden appearances of bronze men descending from the sky, of structures seen rising in the sky at night, then disappearing without a trace. These aren't modern hallucinations. These aren't Roswell stories projected backward. These are accounts written in classical Latin, preserved by the Church, and hidden from the public. And for a reason. Because if humanity ever confirmed contact, happened not after Roswell, not during the Cold War, but during the Roman Republic. Everything we know about religion, power, and history collapses like a temple struck by thunder. And thunder, according to one lost Roman scroll, wasn't always a sound made by gods. In the year we now call 44 before Christ, the Roman Empire was no longer a theory. It was an engine, an unstoppable, bureaucratic, militarized machine that documented everything with obsessive precision. Grain tallies, troop movements, rainfall records, birth registries. Roman scribes didn't merely record events, they engineered posterity. Which is why what happened on the 7th day of Martius in the province of Hispania cannot be dismissed as folklore or religious metaphor. The original scroll, written in vulgar Latin and attributed to a Roman tribune named Decimus Valerius, describes a discum igneum hovering above the garrison's encampment. The disc was silent, metallic, emitting light from its underside. Valerius, a skeptic of omens and devout follower of Jupiter, documented it with military precision, height, estimated size, duration of visibility, but most crucially, He notes the reaction of the men, not fear, not reverence, confusion. The legionaries, trained killers, were disoriented, unable to respond to verbal commands during the sighting. Their formations collapsed. Valerius was disciplined for the failure, yet the report was preserved, not destroyed. Why? Now consider this. This scroll was never sent to Rome. It was instead copied by hand, referenced only in the margins of one document catalogued in the Vatican's Codex Argenteus, and then buried in the sub-archives beneath the Secret Archives division, now politely renamed the Apostolic Archive. The incident was one of more than 20 similar entries discovered between the years 50 and 120 of the Common Era, all describing metallic apparitions in the sky, seen over Judea, Britannia, and Asia Minor. One report, allegedly scribed under Emperor Trajan, claims that the appearance of a brightly burning vessel caused a temporary blindness among a detachment of Syrian archers. And yet none of this was ever integrated into the state annals, not because it was unimportant, but because it contradicted the empire's core ideological foundation. Rome ruled the world, and the heavens obeyed Rome. To admit otherwise would be to accept that even the gods were being watched. And who was watching Rome? The deeper you dig into the Vatican library's sealed registers, many written in code, ciphered script, or suppressed dialects, the more a picture begins to form, not of divine prophecy or angelic visitation, but of a phenomenon that Roman leadership could not name, could not fight, and therefore chose to erase. The role of the Church in this erasure, not passive, not accidental. They inherited the empire's silence and they sanctified it. And somewhere in a chamber lined with foot-thick iron doors, a librarian, unseen, unknown, still turns those ancient pages in silence to understand why the Vatican would preserve, but never reveal, evidence of pre-Christian encounters with unidentified aerial phenomena. We must first dismantle the lie we've been conditioned to believe, that religion and science have always been at odds. This binary is convenient, especially for modern minds raised on Enlightenment rhetoric. But in truth, for over 1,000 years, the Catholic Church was the only global institution funding science, preserving manuscripts, and deciding what version of truth deserved to survive. And within that control structure was an elite priesthood known not for prayer, but for classification, the custodians of the index. These were men trained in philology, astronomy, cipher-breaking, and most critically, theological containment. If a text contradicted church doctrine but could not be destroyed, either due to its historical value or political risk, it was sequestered, studied, and, if necessary, rewritten, which brings us to one of the most controversial documents never released to the public, Codex Lucianus Nom. Officially labeled a Gnostic heresy by papal decree in the early 6th century, this codex is referenced obliquely in Vatican records as De Apparitionibus in Temporibus Caesarum, translation, of the apparitions in the time of the Caesars. The manuscript is written in a Latin-Greek hybrid and attributed to a Syrian physician named Lucianus of Antioch, a contemporary of Galen. In it, Lucianus recounts conversations with Roman soldiers, temple scribes, and astronomers who described recurring phenomena in the skies above the eastern provinces, objects that defied celestial logic. These weren't comets, which the Romans understood, nor meteors, which they feared as omens. Lucianus writes, explicitly, of artificial stars that changed direction mid-flight, remained stationary in the sky for days, and emitted pulses of light at intervals resembling intentional patterns. One particularly disturbing entry describes a metallic cloud that hovered above the temple of Apollo in Didyma for 9 full nights. During this time, livestock died en masse. Local priests reported vivid auditory hallucinations, and the stars above the structure were reportedly blotted out as if by an unseen shield. Lucianus, though skeptical of superstition, noted that every water source in the village turned undrinkable during the sightings. Now understand, this wasn't a third-hand rumor scrawled on a monastery wall. This was a first-hand medical report from a state-funded physician who, under oath, swore the account to be factual and observable. And yet the Codex Lucianus IX was seized by the Vatican in the year 137 during the reign of Pope Hyginus. The text was never translated, never cited in church theology, but it was not burned, it was hidden. Why? Because the church didn't fear fiction, it feared evidence. Evidence that ancient civilizations, not just Romans, but Egyptians, Sumerians, even pre-Incan societies, had documented interactions with entities not of this world. Entities whose descriptions remained eerily consistent across thousands of miles and centuries of isolation. What scholar could explain that without invoking either collective hallucination or something far worse? A truth so destabilizing that it would dismantle both theological authority and historical narrative in one stroke. And so these documents were locked away, not because they were irrelevant, but because they were too relevant, too coordinated, too specific, and because once you admit Caesar saw them, you must admit we never stopped seeing them, only stopped admitting it. The Vatican is not a library, it is not a church, it is not a museum, or even a political enclave masquerading as a state. The Vatican is a vault, an intelligence agency cloaked in incense. While the world imagines white-robed clerics tending to dusty tomes, the truth is far more operational. For over 1,500 years, the Holy See has maintained a global network of informants, linguists, archaeologists, and cryptographers, all bound not by faith, but by function, to control the narrative of human history. And nowhere is this more evident than in the silent corridors of the Vatican Apostolic Archive, formerly called the Secret Archive, a name so intimidating it had to be rebranded. But the secrecy didn't go away. It was just renamed. The archive houses over 85 linear kilometers of shelving. Let that sink in. More than 50 miles of documents, many written in extinct languages, others encoded in theological riddles, and a select few, so sensitive, they've never even been indexed. No title, no card, no file number. And buried within these corridors is a cluster of manuscripts, tagged as non-theological anomalies. This is internal church jargon. It refers to events recorded by early Christians, bishops, or even heretical movements that describe incidents not explainable by Scripture but too coherent to dismiss. Among these anomalies is a parchment attributed to Bishop Athenagoras of Athens, dating to the late 2nd century. Athenagoras, a respected apologist of Christianity under Marcus Aurelius, wrote a letter to a Roman consul describing a luminous object that hovered above his villa for 3 consecutive nights. He describes it as a wheel of light which did not burn but hummed like a flute played through the stone. He interpreted it not as angelic, but as a sign from the stars which know not the sun. This phrase, carefully written, then crossed out and rewritten, suggests a deliberate theological distancing. It was not divine. It was something else, something older, something not subject to salvation. This pattern repeats. In the writings of Eusebius of Caesarea, one of the early fathers of church history, there are passages, redacted in later copies, that refer to beings clothed in fireless light, appearing to shepherds and causing animals to fall silent for hours. In one entry, he writes of metal birds which carry no wings and descend upon the earth with noise like thunder, yet cause no harm. These records were once copied freely, but after the Council of Nicaea in 325, the Church's doctrine had to be standardized, and anything that did not reinforce the newly unified narrative of Christ's divinity, the Holy Trinity, and divine intervention was methodically removed, rewritten, or buried under the justification of doctrinal purity. But again, these texts weren't destroyed. They were hidden. Why preserve them? Because the Church never intended to lose power. And power requires contingency. If one day, undeniable proof emerged of life beyond Earth, of contact, influence, or surveillance, the Church could not afford to be caught unprepared. They needed a framework, a narrative, a defensive theology, and the only way to prepare for that moment was to retain the documents that could support a pivot, a secret doctrine of extraterrestrial accommodation, a theology of the others. And they already had it, written, stored, protected, waiting. And if you think this is fantasy, ask yourself, why are these documents not digitized? Why are they not included in Vatican exhibitions? Why are researchers required to submit their topic in advance and denied access if the topic is non-doctrinal? What other global archive censors not by classification, but by ideology? The answer is simple. Because some truths aren't forbidden, they're delayed. Until the Vatican decides the world is ready. Let's move from Rome to Alexandria. Because if the Vatican is the body of religious power, then the Library of Alexandria was its brain before the fire. Or so we're told. But what if I told you the Library of Alexandria wasn't entirely destroyed? What if the greatest manuscripts of the ancient world, Egyptian, Greek, Babylonian, didn't burn, but were selectively removed long before Caesar's legions lit the torches? That's not conspiracy. It's logistics. Multiple historical sources, from Strabo to Ammianus Marcellinus, suggest that documents were relocated to other sanctuaries before the fires. And there was no safer sanctuary than the Church, which by the 4th century had forged alliances with both Byzantine and Egyptian clerics. They didn't need to save everything, just the dangerous parts. The records of pre-Christian contact with unknown intelligences, the blueprints for technologies Rome could not replicate, the diagrams of flying vessels drawn by anonymous hands in languages no one speaks anymore. And among those salvaged documents is a now fractured manuscript, known only by its translated title, The Testament of the Sky Priests. This text, referenced cryptically in the writings of Arab polymath Al-Kindi, and later in medieval Jesuit commentaries, allegedly describes encounters between Egyptian astronomer priests and what they called the minds beyond the flame. These were not gods in the Egyptian pantheon. These were beings described as arriving not in chariots, but in houses of copper that sang with the wind and defied stone. One preserved illustration, now believed to be held in the Vatican's cartographic annex, shows a disc-shaped vessel hovering above a stylized rendering of the Giza Plateau. But more shocking is the marginal note. They do not seek worship, only observation. Let that sit with you. These entities were not there to be gods. They were there to study. Why is this significant? because it destroys the narrative of divine origin, not just for Christianity, but for every organized religion founded on the myth of singular revelation. If pre-Abrahamic civilizations had documented contact with advanced non-human intelligences uninterested in salvation or dominion, then the foundational events of Sinai, Nazareth, and Mecca could be reinterpreted not as unique interventions by God, but as overlapping episodes of observation by a higher, uninterested intelligence. In other words, what we call miracles may have been tests, trials, or worse, accidents. But the Church could not allow this interpretation. It would collapse its monopoly on truth. So they created a firewall, a theological quarantine, where any such evidence was archived under natural phenomenon, heretical interpretation, or simply left unnamed. The very phrase, non-doctrinal anomaly, exists to neutralize power in language. It tells you something was observed, recorded, stored, but not believed, and therefore it must not matter. But it does matter, because the Vatican's refusal to destroy these texts betrays their true position. They don't dismiss the possibility. They fear its timing. To them, disclosure isn't a question of if, but when. And they want to be ready when it happens. Ready with their narrative, ready with their theology, ready to spin the ancient past as preparation, not contradiction, and most of all, ready to say, we knew, we always knew. Now imagine this. It's the year 1492. Columbus has just returned from the New World, and in the corridors of European power, maps are more valuable than gold. But there's a map, drawn not by Columbus, not by Vespucci, but by a Turkish admiral named Piri Reis, that defies every law of cartography. This map, now stored in the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, accurately depicts the coastline of Antarctica, not as we know it today, buried under ice, but as it would appear without the ice cap, a detail we didn't confirm until the advent of satellite radar in the 20th century. And where did Piri Reis get this data? From older maps, from ancient source material he explicitly describes as from the time of the unknown seafarers. And according to Reis, at least one of those maps came not from Islam, not from the East, but from Latin custodians, a veiled reference to Christian monks in possession of pre-Renaissance cartographic archives. The connection to the Vatican is not hypothetical. Several scholars have confirmed that Jesuit missionaries, operating under the instruction of the Congregation for the Propagation of the Faith, maintained hidden libraries across the Mediterranean, especially in regions where classical knowledge could be harvested, translated, and suppressed. In fact, Vatican letters dating from the 16th century explicitly warn against the dissemination of cartographical heresies, particularly any that depict lands known to the ancients but lost to the flood. Yes, the flood, as in Noah's Ark, as in a timeline-shattering admission that pre-Diluvian civilizations may have mapped the globe. But here's the real secret. In a sealed chamber of the Vatican's Archivum Secretum, a room reportedly accessible only to the Pope and 3 archivists, there is a collection known only by its code, Sangus Caeli, translation, the blood of heaven. According to unconfirmed reports, leaked by ex-priest archivist Marco Gagliardi before his disappearance in 1978, the Sanguis Caeli manuscripts contained not only ancient star charts that predate the telescope, but first-hand accounts of aerial interventions during key moments of biblical history. One scroll allegedly describes a vessel like burning glass, appearing above the Nile during the Exodus. Another references a column of moving light that was visible for 7 days in the desert of Zin, centuries before the concept of pillar of fire was adapted into scripture. These records are not allegory, they're logs. So what does the Vatican do with these materials? They translate them internally. They analyze them, and then they lock them away, not because they contradict faith, but because they might redefine it. If it became known that the Star of Bethlehem was not a supernatural sign, but an aerial phenomenon precisely maneuvered across the night sky, what would that do to the story of Christ's birth? If the ascension of Jesus was not a divine act, but a technological event witnessed by pre-scientific observers, how would the Church retain its moral authority? They couldn't. Which is why every relic, every scroll, every unexplained chart is guarded with the same intensity as the Eucharist. Because in the Vatican's unspoken doctrine, the greatest heresy is not disbelief. The greatest heresy is proof. Proof that the divine was never divine. Just observed, just recorded, just misunderstood. Let us now dive into the black core of the Vatican's control structure, the Doctrine Preservation Directorate, or as it is internally codenamed, Camera Veritatis. This body does not exist on paper. No Vatican website lists its members. No press releases ever mention its function. But former insiders, those who've either defected, been silenced, or disappeared, have hinted at its existence for decades. It is said to comprise no more than 13 members at any given time. These are not bishops or cardinals in the traditional sense. They are theologians, military liaisons, linguists, and ex-intelligence operatives brought into the fold under strict oath, protected by the highest ecclesiastical privileges, including sub secreto pontificio, a level of classification above state secrets. Their mission? To analyze and suppress any document, artifact, or testimony that poses a structural risk to the soteriological authority of the Church. Translation: anything that could unravel the story of salvation. Let that phrase sink in. Structural risk. Because the Church is not just a faith. It is an architecture, a geopolitical fortress built atop the assumption that divine history is linear, infallible, and exclusive to its doctrine. But what happens when a document emerges, dated, carbon verified, and referenced by multiple sources, that tells a different story? That humanity has been guided, monitored, and even genetically influenced by non-human intelligences long before Genesis was ever written? Consider the case of manuscript LL12, allegedly uncovered during an excavation near the Qumran caves in the early 20th century, just prior to the Dead Sea Scrolls. The manuscript was written in Aramaic and bears structural similarities to the Book of Enoch. However, instead of angels, the text refers to beings of the outer blackness who descended in vessels of fireless metal and whose faces bore neither mouth nor eye. These beings reportedly taught early humans agriculture, metallurgy, and, most disturbingly, ritual blood procedures that mimic early Christian Eucharistic rites. The manuscript's chain of custody, seized from local Bedouins by a joint British-Vatican archaeological team, translated by Jesuit scholars in secret, and never seen again. The Vatican's response? Silence, not denial, not condemnation, just absence. Because acknowledging its existence would invite the question, who really wrote the Bible? If humans were influenced, coached even, by advanced non-terrestrial intelligences, What becomes of divine revelation? What becomes of Moses, of Abraham, of Paul? But Camera Veritatis doesn't just hide manuscripts. It manipulates history itself. Through strategic alliances with governments, universities, and select museums, they influence which findings are published, which are ridiculed, and which are simply lost in transit. Ever wonder why certain archaeological digs abruptly stop? Why certain scholars suddenly retract their theories after private meetings with ecclesiastical advisors? This isn't accidental. It's control by silence. And then there's the software. Since the mid-1980s, the Vatican has employed proprietary classification algorithms developed in partnership with Italian defense contractors to scan and catalog every incoming document against a pattern-matching database of epistemic threats. If a text contains language resembling known visitation reports, metallic celestial vehicles, or non-human anatomical descriptions, it is flagged, extracted, and rerouted, not to public archives, to Camera Veritatis, where it vanishes. Why this level of paranoia? Because the Vatican is preparing for a future moment, a fracture point, a day when disclosure cannot be prevented, when a foreign body enters our atmosphere live on broadcast, when governments are forced to admit the contact they've concealed. And on that day, the Vatican must appear not as surprised, but as chosen, as the only institution that knew all along and kept the knowledge for the good of mankind. And in that moment of global theological freefall, they will open a chamber. They will release a curated version of the truth, sanitized, pre-approved. And they will say, "We told you this was part of the plan." But they didn't. They erased the plan and wrote a new one, in Latin. The Church's deepest secret may not lie in a manuscript or artifact, but in a name, a single name buried in apocryphal texts, referenced only once in a Vatican codex that has never been released in full, Malachim ex Caelo, the angels from the sky. This codex, rumored to be a compendium of translated texts from Sumerian, Akkadian, and Proto-Hebrew sources, was compiled by the Order of the Holy Translator, a little-known ecclesiastical group founded in the 11th century for one purpose: to reinterpret ancient pagan texts under a Christian theological lens. Their mission was simple. If it could not be destroyed, it had to be absorbed. Pagan gods became demons, folk healers became heretics, and beings from the sky, visitors with no trace of wings, no robes, no message of salvation, were recast as angels in disguise. But Malachim ex Caelo doesn't describe angels. It describes entities that arrived from the house of the firmament, whose chariots made no wheel marks on the soil, whose speech bypassed the tongue, and whose appearance brought silence to the flocks. These were not metaphors, they were accounts. Accounts collected not by mystics, but by literate observers, scribes, temple engineers, astronomers, people who measured, recorded, and differentiated between the divine and the unknown. One entry, attributed to a Babylonian priest named Ishriel, details a silver dome that hovered above the ziggurat of Ur for exactly 6 hours. During that time, the stars above the dome shifted position, despite no movement of the Earth's rotation. A time distortion, a gravitational anomaly. To ancient minds, these were divine mysteries, but to the Vatican's internal analysts, trained in astrophysics and quantum modeling, these reports are something else entirely. Data. That's right. The Church isn't filled with candlelit halls and Gregorian chants, Behind those doors sit supercomputers, machine learning systems, and teams of multilingual analysts cross-referencing ancient texts with modern sightings. For decades, the Vatican has employed astrophysicists under the guise of theological study, and the Vatican Observatory, one of the oldest astronomical research institutions in the world, isn't just studying stars. It's tracking patterns, trajectories, recurrences, because one of the core doctrines of Camera Veritatis is this: they will return, and the Vatican wants to know when. Let's not forget the Jesuit father, José Gabriel Funes, former director of the Vatican Observatory, who in 2008 stated in an official interview, "The possibility of life on other planets does not contradict our faith." That was not a scientific observation. That was prepositioning, a linguistic breadcrumb, a slow acclimation of the flock to a future where extraterrestrial life is not science fiction, but theology in motion. Now ask yourself, how would the average Catholic respond if a ship appeared tomorrow, hovering above a major city, broadcasting nothing, making no demands, just present, observing, not hostile, not divine, just there? The psychological and theological fracture would be seismic, because it would prove that we are not central, not exceptional, not alone. And for a church built on the idea that humanity is the pinnacle of creation, that would be the final heresy. And yet the Vatican would survive. Why? Because they've already rewritten the narrative. They have the texts, the backup theology, the alternative gospel, one in which the visitors were never separate from God's plan, but agents of it, watchers, messengers, not angels in the sky, but surveyors of creation. And the church will step forward, calm, prepared, and say, "See, we told you they were angels all along, but they weren't. They were never angels." And the church knew it. Historical secrecy is one thing, but what about the modern age? The Vatican's control over knowledge didn't dissolve with the Enlightenment, the Renaissance, or even the explosion of information technology. Instead, it evolved. By the mid-20th century, the Church had established covert relationships with intelligence agencies across the globe. CIA, MI6, KGB, sharing information, coordinating narratives, and managing public perception. This is not speculation. Declassified documents and whistleblower testimonies have revealed ongoing dialogues between the Holy See and Western intelligence since the late 1940s, coinciding with the surge in UFO sightings post-World War II. One remarkable example occurred during the infamous Roswell incident in 1947. While official U.S. military records maintain that a weather balloon was the only debris recovered, internal Vatican cables from that period, later leaked by a former Swiss guard, refer explicitly to recovered metallic bodies exhibiting non-human anatomy. These cables instructed Vatican liaison officers to monitor public sentiment and to prepare a theological framework for eventual disclosure. That framework reportedly included containment strategies to prevent panic, misinformation, and loss of faith. Furthermore, during the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962, Vatican intelligence reportedly provided crucial assessments on the psychological impact of potential extraterrestrial intervention during global conflict escalation. In classified memoranda, the Vatican warned that acknowledgement of alien presence might undermine the ideological pillars of both Western and Eastern blocs, potentially destabilizing the fragile balance of nuclear deterrence. They advised discreet messaging and the suppression of any mass exposure. Fast forward to the Apollo missions. While NASA publicly celebrated lunar exploration, Vatican astronomers and theologians reportedly analyzed mission data not only for scientific merit, but also for evidence of prior visitation. According to former Vatican archivists, classified lunar surface photographs showed unexplained artificial structures, geometric patterns, shadows inconsistent with natural terrain, and glints of metallic surfaces that were removed from public releases. These details were quietly shared with selected governments, but kept from the public domain. This collaboration between the church and state agencies isn't conspiracy. It is a symbiosis forged in power and survival. The church offers a global network of influence and moral authority. Governments offer technology and enforcement. Together, they maintain a unified narrative that limits disclosure to a controlled drip feed, designed to gradually acclimate humanity to the truth. The Vatican is not merely a religious institution. It is a guardian of cosmic secrets, an arbiter of when and how mankind learns it is not alone. And the question remains, why does the Vatican fear disclosure? Because it threatens their monopoly, not only on spiritual salvation, but on historical truth itself. Once the veil lifts, centuries of doctrine, tradition, and power could crumble. Which is why they keep these documents locked, not for eternity, but until the moment they choose to reveal the truth on their terms. The Vatican secret does not rest solely in ancient parchments or clandestine meetings. It lives within the very architecture of their doctrine, the mechanisms of belief and control woven into centuries of tradition. To understand this, one must grasp the concept of theological preconditioning, a psychological framework the Church has deployed since the Middle Ages to shape the human response to the unknown. Through centuries of ritual, art, and storytelling, the Church has prepared humanity to accept certain narratives while rejecting others. Take the recurring motif of the angel. Angels are messengers, beings who are powerful but ultimately subordinate to God. They come with signs and wonders, but their role is clear and limited. They affirm divine will, not question it. Now imagine if the Church had revealed the truth that many of these angels were actually observers from another world, entities who neither demanded worship nor offered salvation. The psychological shock would fracture faith on a global scale. This is why Malachim ex Caelo, the Forbidden Codex, was carefully reinterpreted. Its accounts of beings without wings or tongues became angels in popular belief. The theological narrative was rewritten not to suppress information, but to reshape it, to translate the alien into the familiar. This practice extended to the development of Marian apparitions, visions of saints, and other supernatural phenomena recorded across centuries. Many of these, when stripped of their theological gloss, bear striking resemblance to modern UFO encounters: silent lights, sudden disappearances, inexplicable healings. Furthermore, the Church's preconditioning is backed by centuries of cultural reinforcement. From Renaissance paintings depicting heavenly light to Baroque music that evokes transcendence, every aspect of religious culture subtly primes believers to interpret extraordinary experiences within a predefined spiritual framework. This conditioning ensures that when the Vatican eventually releases information about extraterrestrial contact, it will be interpreted not as a threat to faith, but as its ultimate fulfillment. And this moment is approaching. The release of classified documents, leaks from whistleblowers, and the global surge in unexplained aerial phenomena sightings have already begun to erode the Church's monopoly on cosmic truth. The Vatican has responded not with denial, but with controlled disclosure. Carefully calibrated statements from trusted clergy, the establishment of scientific observatories, and theological treatises on the possibility of alien life. These moves are designed to ease the faithful into a new paradigm, one where the extraterrestrial is not enemy, but part of God's grand design. But the true story remains hidden in the shadows, the manuscripts locked away, the ciphers unread, the truth buried beneath centuries of carefully crafted myth. The Vatican's secret is not that aliens exist. It is that they have always been here, watching, and the Church has always known. Consider the impact on global society if the Vatican's archives were fully opened tomorrow. The implications would ripple across every domain: religion, politics, science, and culture. Imagine the collapse of dogma as billions learn that sacred texts are not divinely authored alone, but co-created with external intelligences. The chaos of reinterpretation would be immediate and profound. Churches would face theological crises. Governments would scramble to reassess history, law, and national security. Scientific communities would be forced to reconsider the origins of human knowledge, technology, and even biology. But the Vatican's centuries of preparation reveal a strategic intent to avoid this chaos. By controlling disclosure, they maintain power, not just spiritual, but geopolitical. The Church has long been a political actor, influencing monarchs, shaping empires, and orchestrating alliances. In this new cosmic context, their control over extraterrestrial knowledge becomes their ultimate leverage. They can broker peace, dictate doctrine, and position themselves as humanity's mediator between Earth and the unknown. This is the invisible empire within the visible one. Behind the frescoes and cathedrals is an intelligence network as sophisticated as any government agency, one that monitors global sightings, filters reports, and adjusts theological narratives in real time. One that educates select clergy on cosmic realities while maintaining public faith in traditional doctrine. This duality is essential. It preserves order while allowing gradual evolution. For the average person, the Church's secret may seem irrelevant or fantastical, but for those who study power, influence, and human psychology, it is the ultimate example of narrative control, a testament to how history is not only recorded, but engineered, how truth can be preserved not by openness, but by selective revelation, and how the Vatican, this small city-state, is the guardian of humanity's greatest secret. So next time you hear about UFO disclosures, leaked documents, or extraterrestrial encounters, remember this: the Church has been waiting for this moment for centuries, and when the time comes, they will speak not as shocked witnesses, but as prepared arbiters of cosmic truth. And that truth will forever change what it means to be human. In the final analysis, the Vatican Secret Chronicles are more than mere curiosities. They are a roadmap to humanity's true place in the cosmos. The documents locked away in the apostolic archives, the suppressed manuscripts, the coded marginalia, they all tell a story of observation, influence, and silent guardianship by forces beyond mortal comprehension. These are not myths or legends concocted to inspire faith. They are records of contact, meticulously preserved despite the risk to institutional power. This is the great paradox. The Church, long seen as an opponent to science and reason, has in fact been a guardian of forbidden knowledge, not to enlighten humanity, but to control the timing of revelation. to ensure that when the walls of disbelief crumble, the Church remains the architect of understanding, the mediator between mankind and the unknown. The legacy of Caesar, the scholars of Alexandria, the mystics of the Middle Ages, they all contributed to this hidden archive. An archive that holds not only the past, but the key to the future. For those who seek truth beyond the sanctioned narrative, the Vatican Archives represent both a challenge and an opportunity. A challenge because access is fiercely restricted, shrouded in layers of bureaucracy and secrecy. An opportunity because within those hidden texts lies the potential to rewrite history, to redefine spirituality, and to expand the boundaries of human knowledge. But the greatest secret of all is this: the extraterrestrial presence is not a modern invention. It has been with us since the dawn of civilization, watching, waiting, influencing. The Vatican knows this. The world does not. And the moment the truth is fully unveiled, nothing will ever be the same again. The question is not if, but when, and when that day arrives, will you be ready to face the truth? This is the story the Vatican hoped would never be told. But now, it is. End of narrative. If you want to dive deeper, the journey has just begun.